Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Here are the stories we're following today. We had a retreat in U.S. stocks in the Friday session. I think it's fair to say geopolitical risk is a primary driver, even though we're in the throes of earnings season. In the Friday session, we had the S&P down over 1.2%. We broke below that 200-day moving average. Then if you look at the bond market, yields were down across the Treasury curve, and much of that was tied to haven buying. Also on Friday, we had one of the Fed's more hawkish members, Cleveland's Loretta Mester, saying the Fed is close to wrapping up its tightening campaign. Then we had crude oil prices dipping just a bit here in New York on Friday, although for the 5 trading days of last week, WTI is up about 2.3%. Short while ago, we had the yen briefly weakening beyond 150 against the greenback, that in early Asian trading, right now 149.85. And this is keeping the market on high alert for possible intervention from Japan's Ministry of Finance. Over the weekend, the Nikkei reported the Bank of Japan may review its yield curve control program at this month's policy meeting. And we have market holidays today in Hong Kong, New Zealand, and in Thailand. And we'll take another look at market action for you in about 15 minutes. Brian?
All right, Doug, thanks very much. Now it's time for global news. The U.S. is sending additional forces to the Middle East amid fears that the war could spread. Ed Baxter has that story and the rest of the news from the 960 newsroom. Ed.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. You're right. USS Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, as well as additional air defense. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on ABC, as heard here on Bloomberg, says deterrence is the best course at this point.
What we're seeing is the prospect of a significant escalation of attacks on our troops and our people throughout the region.
Austin says the U.S. will defend its people and bases, and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on CBS, as heard here on Bloomberg, says it is talking to Israel about ground operations, but that Israel has the right and obligation to defend itself.
Not only what they do, but how they do it, particularly when it comes to making sure that civilians are as protected as they possibly can be in this crossfire of Hamas is making. But in terms of what we're talking to Israel about with regard to their military operations, it really is focused on both how they do it and how best to achieve the results that they seek.
He says Hamas is using civilians as shields still and is refusing to let them leave the war zones. More trucks, meanwhile, carrying aid into Gaza have been able to make it through checkpoints, but the United Nations World Food Bank Program Director Cindy McCain in Amman, Jordan, says this won't work long term.
We were able to get 17 more trucks in just now, actually, just a little while ago, I understand, and there's a proposed 40 more tomorrow. But this dribbling of the system is not going to work.
McCain on ABC, as heard on Bloomberg, says the situation of the Gaza Strip is dire and it is horrendous. So U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham is in Tel Aviv with a delegation of legislators, and he lays out what he feels victory looks like in the region.
What is winning? For the terrorist organization to be destroyed, for the people of Israel to have a sense of peace they've lost, for the Palestinian people to have hope they don't have, and for the Arabs and the Israelis to end a conflict that would make the world better.
As well today, Israel says Hezbollah is dragging Lebanon toward war as towns empty there, and the U.S. has ordered non-emergency staff to leave Iraq. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says what is going on in the House is an embarrassment to the Republican Party and to U.S. government as a whole. On NBC, as heard on Bloomberg, he says that he has endorsed Tom Emmer.
We need someone who understands how to do this job. I believe Tom Emmer, our whip, he's been in the room with all of our successes, from our bills to secure the border, from Parents' Bill of Rights, from cutting $2 trillion, getting work requirements. He knows how to do the job across the street at the same time, helping us win the majority. He sets himself head and shoulders above all those others who want to run.
Also blames Democrats for not reaching across the aisle and trying to solve the problems. India says it's cut Canada's diplomatic presence in the country due to the continuing concerns about interference in its affairs. This as ties continue to deteriorate. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Brian.
Ed, thanks very much. Let's get to some of the top stories in the business front now. Markets this week are bracing for some key economic data out in the United States. We'll be getting GDP, for instance, on Thursday. Economists surveyed by Bloomberg say the U.S. economy probably expanded at the quickest pace in nearly 2 years in the third quarter. And that presents a challenge for Fed officials who are debating whether additional tightening is needed. Now, we heard from Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohammed El-Arian. He says the Fed needs to establish a longer-term vision for where interest rates are heading.
I think they need to pivot from excessive data dependence to data dependence that has a greater forward-looking component. So we are going to remain in the situation of great uncertainty because there is no vision as to where this economy is going.
That's Mohammed El-Arian. Separately, we'll be getting the PCE deflator data on Friday, and that will also be closely monitored by the Federal Reserve.
Well, nearly a third of the companies within the S&P 500 will be reporting earnings this week, and this list includes Meta, Amazon, and the U.S. automakers. We have a preview from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
Profit margins will be scrutinized as investors assess how businesses are coping with rising wages, fuel prices, and other costs. Ford and General Motors, still in talks with striking workers, along with UPS and Chipotle, may discuss how they're dealing with the challenges. And investors hungry for info related to artificial intelligence may be able to learn more about the cost of the emerging technology when Microsoft, Alphabet, and Meta open their books. And cost savings could be in focus for Amazon after making an effort to reel things in, according to analysts at Cowen. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
Americans are falling behind on car payments at the highest rate on record. More on that from Bloomberg's Leslie Lotto.
It's getting harder and harder to pay our bills with auto loans up high on our list of challenges. Fitch Ratings reports the percentage of subprime car borrowers behind at least 60 days was up well over 6% in September, the highest it's been since 1994. Interest rate hikes are making newer loans more expensive, which has millions of car owners struggling to afford their payments. A clear indication of distress at a time when the economy is sending mixed signals, especially about the health of consumer spending. Leslie Lotto, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, the iPhone assembler Honhai Precision says it will collaborate with Chinese authorities on unspecified investigations. We have the story from Bloomberg's Joanne Wong in Hong Kong.
The statement follows a report that Chinese tax authorities are conducting checks on Foxconn units in Guangzhou and Jiangsu. The Chinese media newspaper Global Times said authorities are also reviewing land use by parent Foxconn in Henan and Hubei. The latest probe comes after Foxconn founder Terry Gou resigned from the company's board. He's running for president in Taiwan, and in his presidential bid, he said he would not bow to any Chinese threats. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
Australia will suspend its case at the World Trade Organization over China's tariffs on Australian wine imports. We get that story from Bloomberg's Paul Allen.
China will undertake a review of its tariffs on Australian wine, and that's expected to take 5 months. During that period, Australia has announced it will suspend its WTO dispute over China's actions. This is according to a press release from the office of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and this comes ahead of a visit by Albanese to China from November the 4th through to the 7th. It's the first by an Australian leader since 2016, and another sign of warming relations between the two governments. Earlier this month, China released Australian journalist Chung Lei from about 3 years of detention for allegedly passing national secrets to an overseas institution. I'm Paul Allen, Bloomberg Radio.
Paul mentioned Albanese's trip to China coming up the first week of November. He'll also be touching down in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, where he will meet with President Biden. Albanese said the 4-day visit to the U.S. will focus on building an alliance for the future. Well, I'm Brian Curtis, along with Vonnie Quinn. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, and we welcome to the airwaves now our guest, Tony Chuchka, who is Bloomberg Weekend editor in Washington. So, Tony, great to have you on the program. The diplomatic efforts with Israel, especially on hopes of getting the hostages out, along with the aid getting in to Gaza from Egypt, are seemingly delaying this ground offensive that Israel has promised. I'm curious what you're hearing from people. Does this continue for a while, or are you getting some sense that Israel is getting itching to conduct its action?
Well, yeah. Hi, Brian. I mean, for the short answer, of course, is that nobody is saying publicly when Israel might move. There was immediately after the attack by Hamas, its incursion into Israel and killings of civilians. I mean, there was about 2 weeks ago, there was a sense that Israel would have to strike fast and hard, I think, and that has not come to pass. So our latest reporting from the region is that Israel supports the diplomatic efforts are underway, which critically include the U.S. In one sense, and then the Qatar as mediators. And that the goal of this is to release, as we're reporting, a large number of hostages quickly. Now that's quite a task if you consider that there's dozens or maybe up to 200 of them. So,
well, it's controversial too, isn't it? To the extent that if you do a deal, then you get more hostages.
That's always a risk with any of those hostage situations. There's sort of the court of public opinion to consider as well. For Israel, there's been a lot of sort of chatter and talk about the longer this goes on with Israel targeting Gaza, with the bombing, that sort of turns public opinion against. That the risk is of public opinion turning against Israel globally and also in the Arab world. So there's a lot of factors to consider here, and for the moment, at least, Israel, with some prodding from the U.S., as you can tell from public. Not really statements, but certainly hints from people like Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Israel is not quite ready to move yet.
Yeah, Tony, we have some reporting to the effect that Israeli citizens are a little nonplussed with how much the U.S. is asking for. In terms of hostage negotiations and so on, how much can the U.S. ask for? How much will Israel grant?
The U.S. keeps saying, or the Biden administration keeps saying that they're not dictating to Israel. I think that's point one. On the other hand, we all know that the alliance is historic and very tight, and there's also a lot of political pressure, if you like, in Washington from Congress and outside Congress to support Israel. I mean, especially after the brutality of the Hamas attack, which is what started all of this, or at least this latest round. And so what Blinken said on some of the Sunday morning political shows was that the U.S. that the military advice that the U.S. is giving to Israel is focused on how they do it and how best to achieve the results that they seek, they being Israel. So you can read between the lines there, I think.
So the ground offensive itself is one major concern about loss of life and civilians and even the loss of life of soldiers. And then there's also the notion of this spreading into a wider war. Now, Israel warned that Hezbollah is risking dragging Lebanon into the war. Who did they issue that warning to? In other words, it's a kind of, normally when we talk about warning, you warn someone, but they're just actually warning, I suppose, the world that this is what's happening.
Yes, and Iran, which stands behind those groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. The way that's playing out is that the U.S., in this case again, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said that if there was any of these Iranian-backed groups were to attack American forces, there would be a decisive response. Now, that's what you'd expect. The U.S. can't countenance that. It's moved a lot of very heavy military hardware into the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the region. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about Iran and the ultimate specter, of course, of Iran possibly getting involved directly. And there's been a lot of talk about that being a fairly or quite remote possibility. However, it's something you have to take into account. And what Blinken also said is no one wants a second or third front to open. Well, what does that mean? No one presumably also includes the United States, which would then also mean, I think if you read between the lines on that also means some restraint on Israel in terms of Iran.
Presumably, Tony, in the coming days, we are going to see the IDF go into Gaza on the ground. Is that enough to provoke another nation to get involved or another military group?
That's anybody's guess. I don't know. I don't know what the planning. Clearly, there's scenarios that are being mapped out, and that has to be part of it. And I think that's why all of this talk about Iran is quite prominent now in the public commentary. But Israel's goal stated goal is to destroy Hamas and remove that threat. So that, in theory at least, it could be a relatively limited operation in the sense of limited strategic goal.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.